Welcome to week 4 of the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series recorded in spring 2021. For information on the Emeritus Institute, please visit www.saddleback.edu/emeritus. Professor Laura Hoffman is the lecture series facilitator. She teaches art history and photography at the Saddleback College Emeritus Institute. It is now my honor to introduce Professor Laura Hoffman, who will in turn introduce today's distinguished guest speaker. Enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. Feldes. I appreciate that. So I am pleased to present today, February 19th, 2021. Saddleback College Emeritus Institute is honored to welcome Dr. Danielle Thomsen. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of California, Irvine. Her research focuses on American politics, the US Congress, and gender and politics. She is author of Opting Out of Congress, Partisan Polarization and the Decline of Moderate Candidates, which examines the rise of partisan polarization in Congress. The central argument is that the benefits of serving in Congress today are too low for moderates to run, further exacerbating the ideological gulf between the two parties. Dr. Thomsen earned her PhD from Cornell University. Her research has been published in the American Political Science Review, the Journal of Politics, Legislative Studies Quarterly, Perspectives on Politics, Political Behavior, Political Research Quarterly, Politics, Groups and Identities, and State Politics and Policy Quarterly. I am proud to present Dr. Danielle Thomsen on partisan polarization and the decline of moderate candidates.
Okay, thanks so much for the kind introduction. I also want to thank Saddleback College for the invitation to be here. And I want to thank Sable and Laura for helping get this set up beforehand. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Just 1 second here. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is my 2017 book titled Opting Out of Congress, Partisan Polarization and the Decline of Moderate Candidates. And I'm an assistant professor, like Laura said, at UC Irvine. I moved here from Syracuse University, where I was a professor there for a couple of years before trading the snow for the sunshine. So here we are. Okay, so just a little bit over a decade ago, about 15 years, Time magazine suggested that the ideological center was, quote, the new place to be. But the numbers, they tell a different story. Since then, virtually all of the moderates in congressional office have retired. One of the more recent examples was Charlie Dent, co-chair of the Tuesday group of moderate Republicans, who announced his retirement in 2018, citing the increased polarization and ideological rigidity that leads to dysfunction, disorder, and chaos. Veteran moderate Republican Senator Olympia Snowe similarly blamed hyper-partisanship and the my way or the highway ideologies in Congress as the singular reason for her exit from office. As Nolan McCarty writes, what is remarkable about this story is how unremarkable it is. Indeed, these articles have become a staple after every election and every notable retirement. What is more, virtually no ideological moderates have entered in their place. There is no overlap between the two parties in Congress today, and the middle has all but disappeared. So this graph shows the sharp decline in ideological moderates since the mid-20th century. Moderates have now vanished from the Republican side, and their numbers have decreased dramatically on the Democratic side as well, though the coalition of Blue Dog Democrats has managed to hang on to a few seats. The absence of moderates from Congress today is particularly striking from an historical perspective, where just 40 and 50 years ago, more than half of members of Congress were at the Ideological Center. At that point, the most prominent committees were chaired by moderates, and even into the 1980s and early 1990s, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats were numerous enough that their votes were needed to pass policies, and they had leverage as a result. This decline in moderates is an integral part of why the current ideological gulf between the Republican and Democratic parties is now at a post-Reconstruction high. Partisan polarization has been one of the most prominent topics in congressional scholarship for the past decade. The policymaking process is almost completely divided along partisan lines, and the discord that now pervades Congress fuels government gridlock and impedes legislative productivity. I also want to briefly mention here what a growing number of scholars have called asymmetric polarization. And this is the idea that while both parties have moved away from the ideological center, the Republicans have moved farther to the right than the Democrats have left. My primary focus is on the decline of ideological moderates in both parties, but I'm happy to talk about asymmetric polarization more in the Q&A as well. Okay, so I just want to stop here and talk a little bit about why polarization matters and why it is a topic that so many people, scholars, journalists, political observers, and pundits alike care about this. So I would say the primary reason why polarization became such a prominent, the prominent topic that it is because of the increase in legislative gridlock that we've seen emerge over the last 2 decades. So Sarah Binder at Brookings Institution did the foundational work on whether or not Congress is able to address salient, pressing political issues. And she found that as the distance between the two parties increased, Congress's ability to address these large national problems declined. I put a graph here that shows just the number of bills passed on the y-axis and the ideological gap between the parties on the x-axis. This is another way of measuring gridlock or inability to get things done. Okay, so we see a clear downward linear relationship, negative linear relationship between the ideological gap between the parties, or partisan polarization, and the number of bills that Congress is passing. The other reasons that people care about polarization are related to the tone or the tenor of the policymaking process. It used to be the case that members were friends with each other, they took trips with each other, their families knew each other across the partisan aisle, and these kinds of relationships have broken down into mostly partisan ones. And then more generally, congressional approval is at record lows. So I always show levels of congressional approval to my Intro to American Politics class, and it's really striking the broad trend. So because we have these questions from the mid-70s, we can compare congressional approval 30 years ago, 40 years ago to congressional approval today. And it's really striking because congressional approval before the early 2000s fell below 20% only twice, in 1979 and in 1992. Since then, since the early 2000s, the norm has been for levels of congressional approval to hover between 10 and 20%. So we see very low levels of approval and historically low levels of congressional approval. So these are some of the reasons why this is a topic that so many people care about. So to better understand the various mechanisms that are driving these recent partisan trends, my research examines the types of individuals who run for office, or put differently, the choices that voters have when they go to the polls. My particular concern is why polarization has persisted and continued to increase in more recent years. And I suggest that the growing distance between the two parties in Congress is due in part to the ideological makeup of the supply of congressional candidates. The main argument is that moderates are less likely to run for and remain in Congress than those at the extremes because the benefits of serving in office are too low for them to do so. This is important because if the only individuals who run for office emerge from the ideological extremes, it's unlikely that polarization is going to fade anytime soon. So I'm going to talk mostly about my book today, but more broadly, I'm interested in who runs for Congress and how the quality of legislative representation is diminished when only a narrow subset of individuals seeks elected office. The decision to run for office and patterns of candidate entry have received little attention from polarization scholars, but this how of polarization is really crucial for thinking about how to address and counteract these troubling trends in Congress going forward. So I'm going to start today by reviewing what we do and don't know about polarization. I'm going to talk about how my theoretical argument builds on the current literature and extends our understanding of polarization. Then I'm going to introduce a unique data set that I use to test the argument. And I'm going to briefly show how the general framework that I introduced and talk about can be applied to other questions beyond polarization, and in particular to recent trends that we've seen in women's representation. Finally, I'm going to talk about extensions of the project and other ways in which the findings are relevant to future research. Okay, so I first want to briefly discuss two culprits that are widely perceived to be, but probably are not, driving recent changes in polarization. The first of these is gerrymandering. You've probably all heard of gerrymandering. It is often maligned in the broader public. So the basic logic is that districts have become increasingly safe, that electoral competition has declined, and that only very conservative Republicans and very liberal Democrats can win in conservative and liberal districts. However, the academic consensus is that gerrymandering matters anywhere from a little bit to not at all. First, there are the obvious counterpoints of the Senate and at-large congressional districts, which have experienced increasing polarization, but no redistricting because the district borders remain the same. Moreover, scholars have shown that polarization is due to differences in how Republicans and Democrats represent moderate districts, rather than an increase in the number of extreme partisan districts. The second most commonly cited culprit for polarization points to primary elections. The logic is kind of similar. So safe districts suggest that the heart of competition is at the primary stage, and that candidates try to maximize their votes from extreme party activists. However, it is again difficult to find empirical support linking party primaries with polarization. There is little evidence that the introduction of primary elections, that the level of primary turnout, or the threat of primary competition is associated with partisan polarization in roll call voting. Differences in primary rules also seem to provide few answers. Closed primaries, or those in which only party members can vote, do not produce more extreme candidates than open primaries. Similarly, a few recent studies of the top two primary right here in California show that it has yet to produce more moderate candidates. But there are more studies emerging, and this could change in the coming years, but that is the state of the literature today. In short, while it is widely assumed that gerrymandering and primary election systems are driving recent changes in polarization, the evidence to support this claim is lacking. Political scientists have instead focused on two main types of explanations for polarization. We can divide these into mass level explanations and elite level explanations. Mass level explanations take a few forms. So we know first that the parties have realigned regionally, with the Democrats losing out in the South and the Republicans losing out in the Northeast. Second, we know that voters are better sorted ideologically into their respective parties, with conservatives aligning with the Republicans and liberals now aligning with the Democrats. And third, while the question of voter polarization has been heatedly debated in the literature, most scholars agree that partisan activists are more extreme than they used to be. Elite level explanations instead point to procedural changes that have occurred within Congress. Both parties have become more homogeneous over the last 50 years, and members delegate more power to the party leadership to pass an increasingly partisan legislative agenda. Party leaders have assumed greater responsibility in allocating committee assignments, setting the legislative agenda, and structuring debate on the floor. Majority party leaders in particular draw extensively on legislative procedure to exert their will, and the divides on procedural issues have further exacerbated the disparity between the parties. So my research builds on these explanations, but sheds new light on the puzzle of polarization by instead analyzing the types of candidates who run for congressional office. And I suggest that the skewed supply of congressional candidates is an untold part of the polarization story. My book examines two distinct mechanisms that drive these recent partisan trends in Congress. The first is the abstention of moderates from the candidate pool. So I focus on state legislators because they've long been understood to be in the pipeline to congressional office. A political scientist at Duke University named Nick Carnes, his data has shown that more than half of all members of Congress have state legislative backgrounds. And this makes sense because it's at the state legislative level where many members learn how to legislate and how to campaign for office. The second mechanism for why there's been a hollowing out of the middle examines the types of members of Congress who are leaving office. So I analyze member retirement patterns, and I find that moderates are less likely to seek re-election than those at the extremes. I also conducted more than 20 interviews with former members of Congress who were ideological moderates to get a better sense of the types of experiences that moderates had as polarization in Congress increased. I'm going to be inserting some of their insights into the talk, but I can also speak more about the interviews afterward if you'd like as well. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on the abstention of moderates from the candidate pool today for a couple of reasons. For one, the decline in moderates in congressional office has been discussed almost exclusively in terms of member attrition and procedures within Congress. But as Adam Bonica, a professor of political science at Stanford University, says, the more relevant question is why a new generation of moderates never arrived in Congress to replenish their ranks. So we know that the replacement of moderates is responsible for much of the rise in polarization, but we know little about why these replacements are more extreme than their predecessors. Second, there have been virtually no empirical analyses of why some state legislators run for Congress and others do not, or more generally of how ideology matters for the decision to run for office among those in the candidate eligibility pool. So the argument here is not incompatible with either elite level or mass level explanations. And in fact, it builds on them. But it does shift the analysis to the candidate level to more fully understand why the parties have continued to move towards the extremes. And again, this how of polarization is especially important as different types of actual policy solutions are being proposed and put in place as a way to minimize polarization. For example, initiatives that seek to hire third parties to draw congressional districts or efforts to change the type of primary system might not be a cure-all or even a partial solution for decreasing polarization in Congress. So my book develops a party fit explanation for why some individuals seek elected office and others do not. The decision to run for office is particularly important in the US context because political candidates here have traditionally been understood to be self-starters. So they file their own paperwork to become a candidate, they raise their own money, and they're in charge of their own campaigns. While party leaders certainly try to encourage and discourage individuals, the decision to run for office is ultimately made by the candidate herself, and it's the candidate who bears responsibility for the outcome of the election. So there are a variety of factors that influence the decision to run for office, like whether there's an incumbent running for re-election, the partisan makeup of the district, the individual's ability to fund a campaign, and their previous political experience. I introduced the concept of party fit into studies of candidate emergence, and I suggest that ideology also matters for the calculus of candidacy and the decision to run for office. So party fit is simply the ideological congruence between a candidate and the party to which she would belong upon election. And the central argument is that party fit matters for a legislator's ability to receive the policy, party, and personal benefits of the office, with moderates today much less likely to receive these benefits than those at the extremes. In the contemporary political context, it is difficult for moderates to influence the legislative agenda, given that the party leadership sets the agenda. It is unlikely that moderates can advance in the chamber or obtain a choice committee assignment, given that the party leadership has significant control in this realm as well. Furthermore, the congressional environment has become particularly hostile and isolating for those in the political middle, as there are fewer and fewer members who share their ideological worldview. So I depart from Yale political scientist David Mayhew's view of legislators as single-minded seekers of re-election. And I instead focus on these policy, party, and personal benefits of the office. The idea that there is more to running for Congress than simply winning elections has recently been emphasized by members of Congress themselves. In former Arizona Senator Jeff Flake's retirement speech, he said, quote, "We are not here simply to mark time. Sustained incumbency is certainly not the point of seeking office." Former Florida Republican Representative Ileana Ros-Lehtinen said in her retirement announcement, "It was just a realization that I could keep getting elected, but it's not only about getting elected." One of the party recruiters I interviewed said that the ability to get something done is always a question for people that want to serve in public office. One former member who I interviewed said, "Those in office want to affect outcomes. They want to be legislators, not orators." So in my book, I draw on interviews with more than 20 former moderate members of Congress to illustrate how congressional service worsened for those in the middle as the parties became more polarized. I'm going to highlight a few examples of how the policy, party, and personal benefits of serving diminished for moderates as the party drifted apart. One member said, quote, we would appoint a moderate. We would appoint a delegation to see the speaker, majority leader, or whip and say, I've got 40 votes in my pocket that are no unless you bend the policy. We, the moderates, were a force to be reckoned with. If we didn't go with them, they didn't have a majority. We could influence policy on a daily basis. Fast forward about 20 years, another member said, you can't go across the aisle to get like you used to get things done. People come here to get things done. They came to help their community, get things fixed in their community, and create a better quality of life. You can't do that now. It does change the reward for all the sacrifices you make to be there. Another member said, with respect to the diminishing party rewards for moderates, quote, if you dare deviate too much from the party line, you pay a penalty. The next time comes around and you want a better committee assignment, you're given little attention. I didn't have a chance of getting Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, or Appropriation because I deviated too much from the party position. Former Ohio representative said, quote, when we lost the majority, who's a Republican, when we lost the majority in 2006, the ranking member determined that my future wasn't on the railroad subcommittee, it was on the Coast Guard subcommittee, which was not a very good post, particularly for somebody from Ohio. I objected and he said, well, it's your labor votes. We can't have you do that. I went to the speaker, John Boehner at the time, his friend, also from Ohio, and he said he'd talk to the ranking member. He did, and it didn't make any difference. The member concluded, they can't kill you, but what they can do is indicate, well, you're done. You're not going to be in charge of railroads anymore. I think some of the most interesting insights to come out of the interviews were with respect how the interpersonal interactions in Congress changed over time. Almost all of them talked at length about how the job itself became frustrating, unsatisfying, and increasingly confrontational. Everything was a fight. Every day going in and being the odd man out, it's grueling, it's exhausting, it's corrosive. Another member said it's not fun anymore. Your job is not supposed to be fun like going to an amusement park, but it should be pleasant. Members are saying it's not pleasant anymore. Legislators now have such intense feelings. You're viewed like a heretic by people who have a different point of view than you. That's not very good, not very healthy for the Republic. So the main expectation or the main hypothesis of the book, the main argument, is that ideological moderates, liberal Republicans, and conservative Democrats are less likely to run for Congress than those at the extremes because the benefits of serving in office are too low for them to do so. Again, I focus here on moderates due to their prominent place in the literature and their importance for the widening gulf between the parties and the rise in polarization. But I'm also happy to talk about ideologues and how the policy, party, and personal benefits of the office differ for moderates and those at the extremes. Okay, so on to the data. So I drawn a new, well, it was new at the time, it's still new-ish, data set created by Adam Bonica, the professor of political science at Stanford University, that places a wide range of political actors on a common ideological scale. So he uses campaign finance data to create ideology estimates of members of Congress, state legislators, political action committees, interest groups, as well as individual donors. Importantly here, this data set includes estimates of state legislators who did and did not run for Congress. So there's several advantages to using these data on top of the fact that state legislators comprise the most likely pool of congressional candidates. First, because ideology is placed on a common scale, we can readily make comparisons across individuals as well as levels of office. Second, due to the size of the data set, there's ample variation across a host of key political and electoral variables, such as seat type and district partisanship. And third, the data are pooled over time and span multiple election cycles. So I used logistic regression to estimate the relationship between a state legislator's party fit and her decision to run for Congress. The model includes more than 30,000 observations of state legislators who did and did not run for Congress between 2000 and 2010. The time period of the data allowed me to speak primarily to recent changes in polarization in Congress, but there's some suggestive evidence that patterns of candidate emergence contributed to partisan polarization in previous decades as well. So the dependent variable, or the outcome that I'm interested in, is just one, if the state legislator ran for Congress in a given year, and zero, if she ran for the state legislature again. The main independent variable is a state legislator's ideological fit with the congressional party. So this is measured as the distance between the state legislator and the party leadership in Congress. I can measure this concept in a lot of ways, but in light of the non-electoral goals that I talked about earlier, it seems most appropriate to measure party fit as distance from the party leadership. A side note is that another benefit of using these estimates is that I can actually measure the distance between the state legislator and the party because they're on a common ideological scale. So this is maybe not relevant here, but it is quite important. So I control for a host of factors that are expected to matter for the decision to run for Congress. Most importantly, I use Chris Tassanovich and Chris Warshaw's ideology measures to control for the ideology of the congressional district that the state legislator either ran in or would have run in. And Gary Jacobson, UCSD professor, his data on whether an incumbent was running in that congressional district. I also account for party, the amount of money they raised as state legislators, their number of terms in state legislative office, gender, and partisan control of the state legislator. Okay. So before getting into the results, I just want to show you the data descriptively and plot it out what it looks like. So in the next few slides, I'm going to reference a handful of some current, but also many former members of Congress as well. So these include conservatives like former House Speaker John Boehner on the Republican side, and liberals like current Speaker Nancy Pelosi on the Democratic side. I will also refer to prominent moderate Republicans like former Senator from Maine, Olympia Snowe, and prominent moderate Democrats like John Tanner, co-founder of the Blue Dog Democrats. We can see here that they fall along the ideological distribution, much as we would expect, with Boehner and Pelosi towards the Republican and Democratic ends, respectively, and Olympia Snowe and John Tanner closer to the ideological center. So there's two things to note here. One of which is that the measures are valid, like what I just talked about. They conform to what we think about when we think about the ideology of these individuals. The second thing to note is the overlap in the middle. Okay, so in the state legislature, there's a lot of purple that you see. So more than at this time, I don't have the data currently, but at this time, more than 30% of Democratic state legislators were at least as conservative as John Tanner, and 20% of Republican state legislators were at least as liberal as Olympia Snowe. So what this tells us is that it's not the case that there are no moderates who are available to run. Okay, so the purple is the overlap in the middle among state legislators. Now here is the distribution of the runners, those who actually ran for congressional office. We can see first that Boehner and Pelosi are now squarely in the center of the distribution of runners. We can also see that there are virtually no runners, no candidates who resemble John Tanner and Olympia Snowe. The overlap, the purple that we saw in the previous graph, has almost disappeared when we look at those who run for Congress, those who throw their hats in the ring, among those who were eligible or qualified to do so, okay, or most likely to do so. Put differently, here's the proportion of moderates and ideologues in state legislative office who ran for Congress. So very few people run for Congress. Pretty much nobody runs for Congress. But nearly 3% of state legislators who resemble Pelosi and Boehner ran for Congress, compared to 0.6% of Democratic state legislators who resemble John Tanner, and 0.2% of Republicans who resemble Olympia Snowe. In short, moderate state legislators are much less likely to run for Congress than conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats. To be sure, the likelihood that any state legislator runs for Congress is very low, but these differences across state legislators are really striking. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you some results for open seats due to the fact that most state legislators wait for an open seat, and more incoming members typically enter through open seats or races where there's no incumbent in the race. Patterns of candidate entry in open seats are thus particularly important for understanding recent changes in polarization. As Gaddy and Bullock write, open seats, not the defeat of incumbents, are the portal through which most legislators enter Congress. In fact, 3/4 of all incoming candidates during this time period won in open seats. And those who enter through open seats thus have a greater ability to spur aggregate ideological shifts due to their larger numbers. So this graph shows the predicted probability of running across a range of state legislators. So we can see that the likelihood of running for Congress decreases as state legislators' distance from the party increases. The probability that a conservative like John Boehner runs in an open seat is 9% versus 0.9% for a moderate like Sherry Boehlert, a former moderate New York Republican who is best known for his work on environmental protection. Similarly, the probability that a liberal like Debbie Wasserman Schultz runs in an open seat is 2.6% compared to 0.3% for a moderate like Bev Byron, a former Democrat from Maryland who served in the late 80s, who was pro-life and often broke from her party on military and defense-related issues. So the party fit argument highlights the importance of the value of the office for the calculus of candidacy, but a long line of scholarship has shown that electoral considerations, whether you can win, are central to the decision to run. Thus, although congressional districts have become more homogeneous and voters are better sorted into their respective parties, we might still expect to see variation across districts in the types of candidates who run. A larger number of moderate Republicans may run in more liberal districts, and a larger number of moderate Democrats may run in more conservative districts. Or fewer moderate Republicans may run in the most conservative districts, and fewer moderate Democrats may run in the most liberal districts. In addition, we might see variation depending on how conservative or liberal party activists are. Lastly, moderates may be more likely to run in toss-up seats because they expect to attract the most support in the general election. So I examined these various logics with respect to the candidates who ran for Congress between 2000 and 2012. I used Tausanovich and Warshaw's estimates of congressional district ideology and the ideology of Republican and Democratic partisans in each district, and Cook Political Report's list of toss-up seats during this period. So this figure shows that the number of Republican candidates who ran for Congress between 2000 and 2012 who were at least as moderate as Olympia Snowe, the former legislator from Maine that I talked about, across different kinds of districts. So to be sure, we can see that a larger number of state legislators and candidates who resemble Olympia Snowe did indeed run in liberal districts and in districts with the most liberal partisans. And a smaller number ran in conservative districts and in districts with the most conservative Republican partisans. But we must also keep in mind that these figures span 7 election cycles. The general pattern is that very few candidates who resemble Olympia Snowe are running for Congress, regardless of the makeup of the district, the makeup of party activists, or the closeness of the race. Of the nearly 4,000 Republicans who ran during this period, only 228, or 6%, were at least as moderate as Snowe. In short, individuals like Snowe have opted out of congressional elections, and it matters relatively little whether the district is more or less conservative, whether activists are more or less conservative, or whether the seat is expected to be a toss-up. This figure shows the number of Democratic candidates that are at least as moderate as John Tanner, the co-founder of the Blue Dogs that I talked about before. The numbers echo those on the Republican side. A larger number of candidates like John Tanner ran in conservative districts and in districts with the most conservative Democratic partisans. And a smaller number ran in the most liberal districts and in districts with the most liberal Democratic partisans. But again, the general pattern is of individuals like John Tanner simply not running anywhere. Of the 3,600 Democrats who ran for Congress from 2000 to 2010, a mere 170, or 5%, were at least as moderate as Tanner. It is less clear how well these pure electoral-based logics can explain current patterns of candidate entry. At the very least, we would expect to see more variation across congressional districts. Okay, so I want to reiterate here that the previous results highlighted 2 main patterns. First, ideological moderates, liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats in the congressional pipeline, are less likely to run for Congress than those at the ideological extremes. Second, this probability reaches its height among ideologues in open seats, which especially matters for recent changes in polarization because they're the bulk of the incoming elected class. So I want to briefly demonstrate the broader applicability of this argument that I just introduced and talked about to questions beyond polarization. So here I'm going to show how the same patterns of candidate entry and exit that I talked about before have implications for women's representation in Congress as well. Namely, why the percentage of Democratic women has increased since the 1980s, while the percentage of Republican women has barely grown. The Republican women did increase their numbers the most notably in the 2020 elections, but we still see this really dramatic disparity in women's representation between the two parties, with women now making up about 40% of the Democratic Party, and in the Republican Party, women are about 15%, but much larger now than their numbers before, which hovered below 10%. So these really striking differences in women's representation between the two parties. So I'm going to connect what I just talked about to this other trend that's going on as well. Okay. So the number of women in the Democratic Party, and this is kind of an old photo from Pelosi's website, but has grown steadily over the past 30 years. There's now 89 women in the Democratic caucus, last time I checked, and they comprise about, like I said, 40% of the party. This is from an old tweet from Majority Leader Eric Cantor. The representation of women in the Republican Party does pale by comparison, even with the gains made in 2020. Republican women comprise between 6 and 10% of the party in the 1980s, and they've just exceeded or moved beyond the 10% threshold following the 2020 elections. Okay? And they now make up the largest percentage of the party caucus than they ever have, but still much less than women on the Democratic side. Okay, so why are there so few women in Congress? So scholars of gender and politics focus largely on why women do not run for office. We know little about why some women run for office and others do not, or why women's representation varies over time or between the two parties. More generally, the partisan polarization in gender and politics fields have been mostly divorced to date. But this is surprising given the simultaneously growing partisan gap among women in Congress that I just showed you. So my research sheds light on this growing partisan disparity among women in Congress by examining variation across women in the decision to run for and remain in Congress. So this is the first explanation to account for ideological variation across women in the decision to run for office, and the first empirical analysis of how ideology affects the entry of women candidates. So the results that I presented earlier demonstrated that ideological female and male state legislators are less likely to run for Congress than those at the extremes. By further unpacking women as a category, we can see that some women are more likely to run for office than others. For example, a conservative Republican state legislator who resembles former representative from Orange County, Mimi Walters, is dramatically more likely to run for Congress than a moderate state legislator who resembles Olympia Snowe. So I suggest that these ideological patterns of candidate entry and exit matter most for Republican women. First, there is a dearth of conservative women in the congressional pipeline. Second, Republican women in Congress were to the ideological left of their male co-partisans for much of the late 20th century. So the exit of moderate incumbents disproportionately cut the ground out from Republican women in office at the time. So with respect to the makeup of the pipeline, the pool of state legislators, we call this the pipeline to Congress, there are few ideologically conservative Republican women state legislators. Republican women make only a small appearance in the state legislative pool, and there are more than 5 times as many men as women in the conservative half of the Republican pool. Their rates of running are similar for conservative Republican men and women at 2.4% and 2.1%. But because there are so few conservative Republican women in state legislative office, this translates into a huge gender difference in political candidacies. 143 conservative Republican men ran compared to 25 conservative Republican women. On the Democratic side, the gender disparity is much smaller in the pool of liberal state legislators, which is comprised of 36% women and 64% men. Virtually the same percentage of liberal Democratic men and women ran for office, 1.4%, 1.6%, which amounted to 44 women and 74 men. The greater number of women in the ideologically liberal pool of Democrats means that there are more women who have a chance to run in an open seat as well. Second, Republican women were, on average, to the left of their male counterparts throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Members like Olympia Snowe, Connie Morella, Sue Kelly, Lynn Martin, and Nancy Johnson all came from the moderate wing of the party. And Republican women were disproportionately affected by the rise in polarization. There's been a near complete makeover of Republican women in Congress over the past 20 years. The moderates of yesterday have been replaced by the Elise Stefanik's and the Marsha Blackburns of today's. of today. GOP women are also very ideologically conservative, and they are mirror images of the Steve Scalises and the Kevin McCarthys that now dominate the party. In fact, of the 30 Republican women serving in Congress right now, only one has been in office since before 2000, Kay Granger of Texas. You can see here that throughout the 1980s as well as the 1990s, the number of Republican and Democratic women with at least 8 years of experience in Congress was virtually the same. These trends have diverged sharply over the past decade, and the retention rates of Republican women differ dramatically from those on the Democratic side. There are now, like I said, 89 Democratic women in the House of Representatives, and about a quarter of them have served in Congress since before 2000. This comparative longevity in congressional service has allowed Democratic women also to rise to increasingly powerful positions within the chamber as well. So ideological patterns of candidate entry and exit matter for the partisan disparity among women in office as well. My book helps us to understand changes in the types of women who are elected to office and the policies they promote. In the 1980s and 1990s, Republican women were of moderate faction in their party, and many were prominent leaders on a variety of policy issues, including, but not limited to, women's issues. Nancy Johnson, for example, was the first Republican woman named to the powerful Ways and Means Committee. Sue Kelly served on the Financial Services Committee for more than a decade and eventually became a subcommittee chair. These moderate Republican women were part of a highly influential group of swing voters during that time. They mattered not only for levels of female representation, but also for the day-to-day operations of Congress and the nature of policy outcomes. The large turnover of Republican women has implications for recent changes in the ideological profile of Republican women, as well as their ability to advance to influential positions in the legislature. So I want to again summarize the main takeaways from my research. So my book introduces this concept of party fit into studies of candidate emergence and explains why some individuals run for office and others do not. In doing so, I provide a candidate entry explanation for recent partisan trends in Congress, and I highlight the candidate level mechanisms that continue to drive polarization. Lastly, I briefly showed how the framework can shed light on contemporary patterns of women's representation as well. So the common thread across my research is to better understand the decision to run for office and examine how that matters for broad questions that political scientists and the American public care about: the dramatic rise in partisan polarization and the quality of political competition in elections. These questions are also of concern to political reformers, as different types of policy solutions are being proposed and enacted in an attempt to both minimize polarization and promote electoral competition. From a normative perspective, the quality of political representation is compromised when only a narrow subset of individuals runs for office, or when electoral competition is not as healthy as we would like it to be. The democratic ideal deeply depends on, and indeed takes for granted, the existence of a vibrant and diverse pool of candidates from which voters can choose. The composition of the pool of candidates thus has serious consequences for the makeup of Congress and the nature of legislative representation. So I will stop there, and I think it's time for some questions. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomsen. That was very illuminating. Your talk raises so many questions, and I think I'm going to start. I have a couple of questions for you. You mentioned and in your book, the ideological gulf between the Republican and Democratic parties has widened in almost elections since the 1970s. And we experienced this dramatically, especially in the last two election cycles, and they were so contentious. Even families got divided. What do you see for our future going forward?
Yeah, very good question. So a couple of things. One, I'm always hesitant to point to a single election. I think one of the main contributions of political science is to provide an historical vantage point. So rather than, most of these changes are so gradual, they're happening slowly and over time. And this is boring for the media and it's boring for journalists, but it's the truth. and so it's what's happening is these small changes at the margins with each incoming class. And that's how that's how we got to where we are now from 1970 today. There wasn't one single election. There is no magic bullet that's going to solve it either. One of the interesting things about this moment that speaks to what you're talking about, though, is that the message of polarization has reached a much broader audience. It has reached the American public. So polarization used to be something that just scholars talked about and then more wonky journalists. But now many people, many of my introduction to American politics students class have heard about polarization before. And this is one of the contributions, I think one role of that recent elections have played to disseminate this pattern, this phenomenon more broadly. And so I don't want to minimize what you're saying here about it reaching into social relationships, polarization reaching into the lives of everyday Americans. And I think that's certainly true. There's a lot of, a lot of the cars we buy and the beer we drink and the stores we shop at are indicators of our partisan identity. And that is all true. There's other research, though, that I think is kind of interesting, showing that with respect to these family divides. Okay, so there's this large Pew study showing changes in polarization from 1994 to 2004 to 2014. This is the most widely publicly cited report on changes in polarization. And one of their big takeaways was that people don't want their children to marry members of the other party. So that's one of the findings that everybody talks about. Okay. Or the rise in negative partisanship, that you feel worse on a feeling thermometer towards the out party today than Americans used to. Okay? But other people have done some, I think, creative work where they have looked at whether or not family members don't talk about politics. So they vary whether or not you talk about politics. And if you don't talk about politics, then people don't care if you're of the other party. So I don't think family dinners are necessarily ruined for the coming decades. I'll also say another phenomenon that your question brings up that is definitely right, which is that the current climate, and particularly the rise of Trump, has introduced another dimension of conflict. So it used to be that I just saw somebody post on Twitter yesterday that they thought the moderate label was no more, that it doesn't mean anything to be moderate anymore. And what they were implying was now the only dividing line is if you're pro or anti-Trump, if you stand with Trump or don't. And this is a different dimension that is emerging that I couldn't have foreseen since I wrote this before Trump. And I do think that other cleavages can arise as politics change and as the world changes. But I also want to say that ideology is alive and well in a lot of ways in Congress. So there is there's a bipartisan caucus that's made up of, it's called the Problem Solvers Caucus, made up of half Democrats and half Republicans. It's the first ideological caucus to be comprised of members of both parties. So typically you've had the Tuesday group of moderate Republicans, the Blue Dog Democrats of moderate Democrats, but they've been within party caucuses. This is the first ideological caucus that is premised on compromise and bipartisanship, that's been made up of members of both parties. This is sort of a long response, but I would say that there's a lot of ways to think about how ideology works. And it may be that different dimensions become more salient at different time periods. But if you look at the institution of Congress, we can still rank and rate people and place people along ideological lines based on their voting behavior. And that's what we've typically used in the past.
Thank you, Dr. Thomsen. I enjoyed your lecture tremendously. I mean, the timing could not have been more perfect. So my question has to do with no party preference. So how do the growing no party preference voters affect party polarization?
Yeah, so this is like voters who identify as independents.
Yes.
So voters, they're a tough group, this group. So most political scientists, this might also surprise you, are kind of skeptical of the category of no partisan. So if you look at Gallup polls, a lot of the headlines are independents make up the largest share of American voters, something like 40%. And that's true if you give three options. You give Republican, Democrat, and independent options. But if somebody says independent, and then you ask a follow-up question, do you lean toward the Republicans or the Democrats? Then we get a percentage of independents that is much lower. So when we include leaners in our survey questions, the percentage of true independents, so independents who don't then say they lean, is about 8 to 10%. So it's much lower. So I don't know. I don't think they're doing a lot of the work, but a related point is nonpartisan primaries. So like in California, where all parties all candidates of all parties can run together in one party. And this is kind of premised on the idea that independents don't have a voice in the current closed partisan primaries, where you have to be a member of the party in order to participate. And so I think that we see some institutional changes that start with that idea. We don't see them having the kind of effect that people anticipated, but there is some more recent research from a political scientist named Christian Gross at USC, who's been doing a lot of work on the top two primary, and he's suggested some other patterns. But one of the difficulties of studying the top two is that it's new. And so you don't have a lot of data to compare yet. And so this is one area where I think that it's good to be cautious, just because we don't know the true patterns, and candidate decisions can change, and candidate perceptions can change, and voter perceptions can change. But the balance of evidence has suggested that removing party in this way to allow for independent voices to have more of an impact haven't changed the outcome, at least from the polarization standpoint.
Thank you.
All right, my next question has to do with gender. And it's really about the gender gap. And since your book was published, the gender gap has fortunately changed. Um, and also Republicans now have at least 26 women in the House, right? Um,
You know?
or the most they've ever had. And maybe this is the optimist in me, but in California, for example, U.S. Representatives Michelle Steele and Young Kim, and in Texas, Beth Van Doyen was, they were all elected.
Yes.
Could the narrowing the gap change the gender composition to women in Congress, possibly change politics?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So the number of Republican women in Congress today is at an all-time high. That is absolutely true. But the number of Democratic women still outnumber them 3-1. And this is not a small difference. I mean, and before 2020, so Republican gains in 20 Republican women's the gains of Republican women in 2020 were mostly driven by in competitive or toss-up seats. So they fared really well in the 27 districts that Cook Political Report identified as toss-ups. And so one problem with that is that they're also the most precarious, their representation is precarious because they're not being elected from their, because so many came from districts that will be competitive in 2022. Okay, so their representation as a bloc is more precarious than Democratic women's representation because many of the Democratic women are elected in liberal Democratic seats where they're going to keep winning if they keep running. And so if we think about it as a group, the precarity of Republican women is much higher than Democratic women. The other thing about 2020 is that Elise Stefanik and a handful of high-profile Republican women made a concerted effort to recruit and support Republican women. And these things are possible and they happen, but they're not the gradual story that I talk about and that I focus on, which is if candidates are presented with an open seat, they'll want to run. There can be larger changes in the caucus. Like in 2018, the Democrats had a really large increase in their caucus as well. And much of this was driven by dissatisfaction with Trump. And it was also driven by the blue wave in 2018. The same way that much of the Republican gains in 2020 were fueled by the overperformance or the overperformance of Republican candidates in 2020. So the Democrats were expected to pick up 10 to 15 seats. They ended up losing 10 to 15 seats. Okay, so much of the winners, the ones who won of those seats were Republican women. And these are very important, large shifts in a year that can matter for decades to come. I think that we still underestimate the importance of 1992. So there's 5, I think, Democratic women in office today who are committee chairs, and they were all elected in either 1988, 90, or 92. And so these large cohorts of women that are elected can have enormous implications down the road that are really hard to think about today, given that seniority takes decades to build, you know? So it could be the case that the influx of Republican women in 2020 has a real impact on their ability to rise in the chamber. But the fact that so many Republican women were moderates in the 80s and 90s mattered in 2010 when the Republicans took back the majority. And I'm not sure if you remember, but there was a lot of discussion about the fact that there were no women committee chairs at the time. And then they ended up picking one from Michigan, I forget her name, Candace Miller, I think, to chair the ethics committee. It was or an administration committee. It was a committee nobody wanted. And so they were like, well, we'll give Candace, I think it was Candace Miller, this. But from another angle, there weren't Republican women in office at the time who had built the seniority that the Republican men had. And so it's not really gender, it's like who's been in office long enough. And those are the kinds of implications that these wave elections can have in decades from now. But I mean, I've stopped predicting because I'm always wrong. But some of these are the size of the caucus of Republican women, I would expect, is going to be lower after 2022. And that's just related to the districts in which they were elected from. Kind of like how some of the Democratic women who were elected in 2018, not a lot, but some of them, like Kendra Horn, they were elected from moderate districts, or actually conservative districts, and they lost. You know, it's not Kendra Horn. It's like the district swung back to Republican. And that's probably going to happen in some of these districts that elected Republicans this time as well.
Very good. Thank you for that. Karima, did you have any more questions?
Actually, I just wanted to ask a follow-up question. What do you attribute the influx of women both in the Democratic Party and Republican Party to in 2020?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I've written a couple of things that are on this point, and I think that there are certain years where women are advantaged at the ballot box. So in 2018, Democratic women have been outperforming Democratic men in the Democratic primary for a long time. So since about the 2000s, Democratic women are more likely to win than similarly situated Democratic men in Democratic primaries. Republican women and Republican men are pretty much similar, like they have similar levels or rates of victory rates. But in 2018, Democratic men's victory rates sunk to what I thought were record lows at the time, and Democratic women's victory rates in the primary shot up. So I think voters were a huge part of the story in 2018. I've also looked, particularly Democratic primary voters. I also think I've looked at the same thing in 2020, and Republican women were more likely to win for the first time since I have data from 1980 to 2020. Were more likely to win the primary than Republican men only in 2020. So I think there are a handful of elections where, due to a number of social forces, or, you know, the Republicans were, Democratic women outnumbered Republican women in the last Congress by like 6-1. So Republicans had, I would say, like embarrassingly low levels of women's representation. And this perception was exacerbated because of how high women's representation was in the Democratic Party. And so I think that fueled some of this demand for Republican women in 2020 that I don't think will stay, just because gender is not like it's just not usually a predictor of outcomes for Republicans. But in these single moments, it can. I take a different look. So that is something I've written on, and I agree. I wrote it, so I agree with it. But my general approach or way of thinking about things is much slower and broader and long-term. And I've looked a lot at different pools of potential candidates. And so like here I talked about the pools of state legislators to Congress. I've also looked at lawyers. So a lot of candidates are lawyers. They have law backgrounds. So this is an occupational pool of potential candidates. I've looked at lawyers who donate, and Democratic women. There's just so many more Democratic women in that pool than there are Republican women. So for any number of reasons, Democratic women outnumber Republican women by a lot in state legislative office, as lawyers, as donors, like any of these pools that we would think would produce political candidates. There are just fewer Republican women. And some of this is related to women on average being more likely to be Democrats, but it's larger than that because the gender gap in the public is usually like 10 points. And these gender gaps in candidate pools are like 50 points, 40 points. So it's part of it is related to women being more likely to be Democrats, but another part of it is that professional women are more likely to be Democrats, state legislators are far more likely to be Democrats. So the women who are well situated and most likely to become candidates are just so overwhelmingly Democrats that I think you do have to have this concerted effort to pick a handful of Republican women if that is the goal. But it's different than just taking a sort of hands-off approach, which is the usual party approach, and saying, you know, you duke it out in the primary, you know, you raise your own money, you establish your own viability. Like that's the traditional approach. And if we just look at rates of entry among those who are eligible to run, there's just such a dearth of Republican women in any of these places that if not recruited, it would be hard to see how this would narrow. And even if they are recruited, the hill is much higher for Republican women. And now that so many Democratic women are incumbents and they run as incumbents, it's not going to narrow.
So it does sound like the changes are going to be slow indeed. Your topic, polarization, is so timely and explains why work in Congress is slow and difficult. I think my last question would be, what do you foresee? I know we're now 2024 is a ways ahead. Do you see any chance of the two parties coming together? And I know some people have even claimed, why do we have a party system, which I find frightening. At least this two-party system gives us that dialectic and some balance. But what do you see going forward in the 20s?
Well, this is the challenge of today, is the divides that are really kind of created and fueled by Trump. You know, so it's not, are you pro-environmental regulation as a Republican? Like that just sounds kind of a bygone era. You know, now the divide that is getting the most attention is whether Republicans in particular stand or don't stand with Trump. Democrats don't have that kind of issue. They do have, they do have ideological divisions, right? So we have the Progressive Caucus, which is liberal Democrats. You have the Blue Dogs. You have the Problem Solvers Caucus, and then you have a lot of people sort of in the party mainstream. So you can, and it might be that I would expect in 10 years for the parties to be, again, organized along an ideological dimension. But in 2024, the real question about 2024 is what the Republicans will be organized as, because Joe Biden will just run again. And that is unclear. I don't know if it's hard to know what will happen. If Trump loses his grip on the party, then other issues could become more salient. But for now, that looks less likely. But I always go back to politicians' ambitions, and if they stop seeing utility in aligning with Trump, they won't align with Trump. And these are things that are hard to predict as political scientists and hard to know. The current evidence we have suggests that won't happen, but political ambitions are a very strong force.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Thomsen. This has been very illuminating and again, so very timely. It'll be interesting to see, in fact, if we were to watch this recording in 4 years to see how this pans out. So
now it's recorded, my prediction.
But it's only what we know now. But we thank you so much for joining us for this talk today. Very much, I very much appreciate it. Any last words, Karima?
No, thank you. I enjoyed listening to you, Dr. Thomsen. Thank you for all your insights.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a real pleasure to be here.